She came out of the crowd like a flare, head to toe in red, as if she'd dressed for a funeral and chosen the president as the corpse. Capitol Park, Sacramento, 10:04 a.m. Gerald Ford's palm was still warm from the last handshake when Lynette Fromme raised a Colt M1911.45 at arm's length, so close the muzzle looked like another black eye in the sun. The weapon was heavy, old, honest steel. Her hands were steady, devotional. She squeezed the trigger, a hard metallic click, nothing else. No recoil, no roar, only the crowd's breath catching all at once, like a single lung punctured. For a fraction of a second, she stared at the gun in disbelief, then up at Ford, calm enough to be terrifying. Agent Larry Bundorf slammed into her, driving her into the dirt as hands tore the pistol away. The magazine came out. 4.45 rounds stacked like blunt promises. The chamber was empty. Ford was yanked backward through the chaos, faces blurring, radio screaming. On the pavement, Fromme didn't cry or beg. She looked almost satisfied, whispering, "It didn't go off. It didn't go off." Minutes later, in a federal holding room, she sat straight-backed under harsh lights, red dress smeared with grass, eyes flat as glass. Evidence was logged. Colt .45, loaded magazine, fingerprints, witness counts in the hundreds. The charge read like a thunderclap. Attempted assassination of a president, life on the table. She didn't flinch. In her silence was a colder confession. She believed she had done something holy. Before the red dress, before the headlines turned her into a warning sign, she was just Lynette Alice Fromme, thin, bright-eyed, and starving for approval in a house where love was rationed like medicine. Born in Santa Monica, she learned early that affection could vanish without explanation, that a child could do everything right and still be treated like a nuisance. Her father's presence was a cold gravity. Praise was rare. Mistakes were remembered forever. Lynette clung to performance, dance, school, smiles, anything that might earn a softer tone at the dinner table. But adolescence carved a crack through that fragile order. She drifted toward the edges of Los Angeles, where runaways traded names like currency, and the night smelled of exhaust and cheap coffee. She wasn't stupid. She was lonely in a precise, dangerous way, the kind that makes a person mistake attention for salvation. By the late 60s, she'd started sleeping where she could, listening for footsteps outside doorways, learning the quiet survival of street kids who still dreamed of being chosen. Then, one afternoon, in a stretch of California heat that made the world shimmer, she met a man who looked like nothing and spoke like prophecy. Charles Manson didn't offer comfort. He offered meaning. He watched her like he'd been waiting, smiled as if he could see the bruise inside her soul, and called her special with the certainty of a priest. It hit her like oxygen. In his gaze, she wasn't a girl with nowhere to go. She was a disciple. And when he gave her a new name, a new family, a place in his orbit, Lynette stepped into it without hesitation, as if surrender was finally the same thing as being loved. Manson didn't recruit her like a criminal recruits an accomplice. He baptized her. The first weeks were soft, almost gentle. Shared food, shared songs, hands on shoulders, the constant repetition that she was seen, she was safe, she was finally home. Then the rules slid in like needles. Sleep became optional, privacy vanished, and every thought had to be confessed out loud until it no longer belonged to her. He spoke in circles that sounded like truth, turning guilt into devotion and fear into proof of loyalty. If she questioned him, he laughed. If she doubted herself, he rewarded her. Lynette learned fast. The only way to breathe was to believe. The family blurred identity. Names were jokes. Bodies were communal. Time was an illusion. Hunger, fatigue, and rhythm did the rest. Manson would break them down with insults, then rebuild them with affection so sudden it felt like grace. She watched girls who resisted get isolated, humiliated, stripped of certainty until they crawled back seeking forgiveness. Soon, she wasn't just following. She was policing herself. Her old life became a dirty photograph, something she was instructed to spit on. The outside world was poison. Parents were lies. Law was a theater run by fools. Manson fed her a new mythology where he was the center of the universe and everyone else was asleep. Lynette absorbed it like scripture. She stopped thinking in I and started thinking in we. The cult didn't need chains because it rewired the brain. Love became obedience. Obedience became identity. Identity became fate. When they called her Squeaky, it wasn't a nickname. It was a final erasure, a playful sound masking the moment Lynette Fromme disappeared for good. Spahn Ranch sat under the California sun like an abandoned set that never stopped filming. The old movie horses coughed dust, broken fences leaned like tired men, and the buildings smelled of sweat, hay, and rot. At night, the place turned mythic. Fires crackling, guitars whining, voices chanting half-songs that blurred into prayers. Outsiders would have seen poverty and trespassers. Inside, it was a kingdom. Manson moved through it like a shadow with teeth, barefoot, eyes bright, always talking, always shaping reality with his tongue. The girls hovered near him, hungry for cues, for smiles, for permission to exist. He fed them crumbs of praise and then demanded the whole soul in return. Lynette watched how power worked here, not through money, not through guns, but through attention. A glance from him could lift a person into ecstasy. A cold silence could crush them into panic. The ranch was a laboratory where identity dissolved. Hair was cut, clothes exchanged, names replaced. Boundaries were laughed at, then punished. Hunger and exhaustion became tools. Sleep deprivation made the mind pliable, and the endless repetition of his sermons made doubt feel like sin. Spahn, the blind old owner, was treated like a relic, touched, flattered, controlled, another prop in the family stage play. Cars arrived stolen, plates swapped, engines cooled under tarps. Visitors came looking for drugs or thrill and left with their wallets lighter and their stories strangled. Lynette began to understand the true shape of the ranch. It wasn't refuge. It was a forge. It burned people down until only loyalty remained, until every heartbeat matched Manson's rhythm. In that dust and firelight, morality didn't die loudly. It simply stopped being relevant. America didn't learn the name Manson Family gently. It arrived like a knife through the ribs of the summer of love. Shocking, obscene, impossible to ignore. The Tate LaBianca murders turned the country's stomach. Blood smeared on walls, messages written in terror, a sense that evil had learned to speak in headlines. At Spahn Ranch, the news rolled in like distant thunder, and the family reacted not with horror, but with hunger. Manson listened to radio reports as if they were songs written for him, smiling at the panic spreading across cities he'd never owned. Lynette watched his face, searching for cues, and learned the correct emotion. Pride disguised as calm. They called the killers soldiers. They spoke of society as the true murderer, of the victims as symbols, of the violence as prophecy. Reality outside became further proof of their holiness because everyone else was terrified, and fear meant power. Even as the police tightened the net and the ranch felt less safe, the inner circle grew more fanatical. The world called them monsters, so they leaned into the label like armor. When the arrests came and the trial circus began, cameras turned Manson into a demon celebrity. Many followers cracked under scrutiny. Lynette did not. She wasn't convicted for those murders, but she carried them like sacred scars, evidence that the family had crossed a line normal humans couldn't. In her mind, blood wasn't a stain. It was a boundary marker, separating the awakened from the asleep. While America demanded punishment, Lynette's devotion sharpened into something colder. The nation had turned against their prophet, and she began to understand the new rule of survival. When the world hunts your God, you don't apologize. You prepare. Prison didn't silence Charles Manson. It only changed the acoustics. Behind concrete and steel, he learned to speak through paper, through visitors' whispers, through coded phrases that slipped past guards like contraband smoke. The family scattered, but the gravity remained. Lynette treated his absence as a test, not a loss. She drove across California, chasing any doorway that might lead to him. Court hearings, jail corridors, attorney visits, collecting fragments of his voice the way believers collect relics. Letters arrived with uneven ink packed with riddles. The world was collapsing. The trees were crying. The system was a machine that needed to be jammed. She read each line until meaning bled through the words into her bloodstream. Outside, cult life mutated into survival cells, cheap motels, safe houses, drifting sympathizers who kept the mythology alive. Lynette became a messenger, a guardian of doctrine. She repeated his ideas to anyone who would listen, arguing with the intensity of someone defending oxygen. When reporters mocked him, she felt it as personal assault. When prosecutors called him a manipulator, she laughed, because to her, manipulation was simply leadership the weak couldn't understand. Manson's face on television became a holy icon, wild eyes, crooked grin, a man who looked like ruin and spoke like destiny. The more the world hated him, the more Lynette's faith tightened, turning from love into obsession. She began to fantasize about a moment so loud it would break the nation's attention in half, an act that would remind America the family still existed, that the prophet still had disciples willing to bleed. In her mind, bars did not mean defeat. They meant siege. And in a siege, there is only one commandment: strike where it hurts most. The redwoods became her cathedral, not churches, not courts, not flags, trees. Lynette stood among the towering trunks and felt a holiness the modern world couldn't counterfeit, the kind of silence that makes humans seem like insects. She started preaching ATWA, air, trees, water, animals, as if it were scripture delivered straight from the earth. To outsiders, it sounded like a strange environmental chant. To her, it was a weaponized religion, a new mask for the old devotion. Manson's ideas had taught her that society was rotten and violence could be revelation. ATWA simply gave the revelation a cleaner face. She wrote letters to officials, demanded audiences, marched into government buildings with the intensity of someone carrying a divine warning. When she was ignored, the obsession grew sharper, more personal. In her mind, The president wasn't just a politician. He was the symbol of a system poisoning the planet, the man shaking hands while forests died. Every time she saw Ford on television, smiling with that calm, Midwestern confidence, she imagined the redwoods falling like bodies and heard Manson's voice behind her eyes. They won't listen until you force them to listen. Sacramento became the focal point, Capitol Park the stage. She studied photos of the place, paths, fences, open spaces where crowds gathered close to power. She learned the geometry of proximity. She told herself she wasn't planning murder. She was planning a message. But messages don't require bullets. And deep down, she knew the difference. The cult had taught her that a single act could rewrite the world. A TWA taught her how to justify it. She wasn't a fanatic in her own story. She was a messenger carrying the last warning of the forests. And if the messenger had to fire a gun to make history hear her, then the gun became sacred too. Violence didn't arrive as a sudden storm. It crept in as routine. Lynette began moving like someone with a destination she refused to name, always watching, always counting. She walked public parks the way burglars walk neighborhoods, mapping entrances and exits, memorizing where shadows pooled at noon, where police stood when cameras were near. In Sacramento, she studied Capitol grounds from benches, pretending to read while her eyes measured distance and footsteps. She learned how crowds behaved around power, how people leaned forward, how they stretched hands out, how security relaxed when the mood felt friendly. She practiced blending in, smiling at strangers, appearing harmless, wearing softness like camouflage. At night, she replayed these scenes in her head, adjusting angles, rehearsing timing until it felt like choreography. The cult inside her demanded certainty. Doubt was a weakness she'd trained herself to punish. The gun came next, not as a thrill, but as a tool. She touched metal with reverence, bought ammunition with the calm of someone purchasing candles for worship. In cheap rooms, she rehearsed the motion, draw, aim, squeeze, again and again until muscle memory replaced hesitation. She told herself she was only preparing for a moment, not an assassination. Yet she read about presidents and security protocols the way predators read about prey. She wrote letters that sounded like petitions but carried the undertone of ultimatum. Everything became ritual, the route she walked, the clothes she chose, the way she checked her bag twice before leaving. She wasn't running from the law. She was running toward history. In her mind, the country had already committed the crime, destroying nature, persecuting Manson, silencing truth. Her act would be retaliation disguised as revelation. The first steps toward violence were quiet, almost invisible. Just a woman with intense eyes, sitting close to government buildings, learning exactly how near a believer could stand to a president before the world realized belief could carry a weapon. She stopped imagining a future the way normal people do. No wedding, no home, no slow aging into softness. Her mind had been trained to crave impact, not comfort, and impact always came with a price. Prison didn't scare her anymore. It sounded like proof. A cage was still a stage if the world watched. She began to romanticize the idea of losing everything, of being dragged away in handcuffs while cameras flashed, of becoming a name that could not be erased. In the cult logic that replaced her conscience, sacrifice was the purest form of love. If Manson was the prophet, then a disciple had to be willing to burn. She wrote in notebooks like scripture, turning rage into poetry, convincing herself that death or life behind bars would be a holy exchange. The president became more than a target. He became a doorway. One act, 1 second, and the nation would be forced to look at what it refused to see: the dying forests, the hypocrisy, the machine of government that smiled while crushing the earth. She pictured herself pulling the trigger and felt not fear, but relief, like stepping off a cliff that had been calling her name for months. In her mind, the bullet wasn't violence. It was language. It was punctuation at the end of a sentence America wouldn't finish. She rehearsed the aftermath as much as the act. The takedown, the shouting, the courtroom, the sentence. She trained herself to hold a cold face, to deny weakness, to become marble. There was even a strange comfort in the idea that she might fail, because failure could still create legend. Martyrdom didn't require success. It required devotion. And devotion was the only thing she had left that felt real. By the time September approached, Lynette Fromme no longer asked whether she should do it. She asked only one question, quiet and absolute. When the moment arrives, will my hand stay steady enough to make history flinch? September 5th, 1975, began clean and ordinary, the kind of California morning that makes danger feel impossible. At 9:26 a.m., President Gerald Ford stepped into Sacramento's light with the practiced calm of a man trained to wear history like a suit. He was staying at the Senator Hotel, and the schedule was tight. Meetings, handshakes, a short walk to greet citizens before heading toward the Capitol. Secret Service moved in quiet geometry, eyes scanning windows, hands near jackets, radios murmuring coded reassurance. The crowd gathered early, smiling families, office workers on break, tourists, clutching cameras, all of them drawn by the simple thrill of seeing power close enough to touch. Ford looked relaxed, even friendly, the Midwestern warmth that had become his armor after Watergate. He waved, nodded, joked briefly with someone near the rope line. Security read the mood and let the moment breathe. No visible threat, no hostile signs, just a president doing what presidents do, turning human proximity into political fuel. But in the same morning air, another figure was already in motion. Lynette Fromme arrived without urgency, as if she belonged to the day. She walked with a calm that looked like innocence, positioning herself the way a predator positions itself near water. Her clothes were chosen with intention, her posture disciplined, her face quiet. She watched the route, the spacing, the rhythm of security, and felt the world narrowing into a single point. While the city smiled and lifted cameras, she listened only to her heartbeat. The moment was approaching, and every step Ford took toward the park felt like a door opening. At 10:02 a.m., the air in Capitol Park was thick with bodies and expectation, a soft roar of chatter stitched with the click of cameras. Ford moved along the path like a man walking through his own photograph, smiling, shoulders squared, hand extended again and again. People leaned over the rope line to touch him, to press their names into history for a single second. Secret Service stayed close, but not panicked, their suits blending into the crowd's joy, their eyes trained on hands, pockets, sudden movements. The president's pace was steady, almost leisurely, the rhythm of politics. Greet, squeeze, release, step forward. Lynette Fromme drifted closer without forcing space, sliding into the front row as if pulled by gravity. Her red dress made her visible, yet nothing about her screamed danger. She looked like a supporter, like someone who'd waited all morning to see the man up close. Her breathing stayed controlled, shallow and silent, the way she had practiced in cheap rooms and empty parks. She watched the security pattern, the micro gaps that opened when the crowd surged in friendly waves. Ford's hand reached toward another citizen, his body angled slightly, exposing a clean line of approach. Fromme's fingers brushed her bag, confirming the weight inside, the cold geometry of steel. In those seconds, the world narrowed to small details. The sun glinting off belt buckles, the creak of leather shoes on gravel, the smell of grass crushed under feet. Ford was close enough to hear his breath, close enough to be human. Fromme's pulse didn't spike. It settled, as if her body recognized the moment it had been built for. A final step, a final inhale, and she was within arm's length, so close the space between them felt obscene. At 10:04 a.m., the world tightened into a single frame. Lynette Fromme stepped forward like she belonged there, lifting the Colt .45 with a strange tenderness, as if she were offering it rather than aiming it. The barrel rose to Ford's chest line, so close it erased distance, so close that any scream would arrive too late. Her finger curled and the trigger broke. A sharp metallic click snapped through the park, louder than the crowd for one impossible heartbeat. No explosion, no smoke, just that dry mechanical failure that sounded like fate stalling. For a blink, she stared at the pistol, confusion flickering across her calm face like a crack in glass. Then she looked up at Ford, almost offended that history hadn't obeyed. "It didn't go off," she blurted, voice flat and incredulous. "It didn't go off." Secret Service reacted before the sentence ended. Agent Larry Boondorf launched in, driving his shoulder into her torso, slamming her down hard. Gravel tore her skin. Her red dress flashed against green grass like spilled paint. Hands fought for the weapon, fingers twisting. The Colt ripped away as she resisted, more out of belief than strength. The magazine dropped. 4 fat .45 rounds gleaming like blunt teeth. The chamber was empty. Ford was yanked backward, shoved behind bodies, hustled towards safety as radios exploded into frantic codes. People screamed, surged, scattered, faces collapsing into panic, cameras turning from souvenirs into evidence. Fromme lay on the ground, breathing steadily, eyes cold, almost satisfied, repeating the same stunned phrase like a prayer gone wrong. It didn't go off. It didn't go off. In that single click, America heard how thin the wall was between routine and catastrophe. Within an hour, Sacramento was no longer a city. It was a crime scene stretched across radio frequencies. FBI lines lit up from Washington to Los Angeles, the same question pounding every desk. Was this a lone woman or the opening shot of a larger war? The Secret Service secured Ford and sealed the route, but federal agents were already thinking past the park, past the click, into the nightmare of coordinated strikes. Because her name wasn't just a name. It was a signal flare from a cult America thought it had buried. "Manson Family," someone muttered in a briefing room, and the temperature dropped. Photographs of Fromme were slapped onto boards beside old Spahn Ranch intel, prison visitation logs, lists of known sympathizers, addresses that smelled like dust and paranoia. Agents imagined a second gun in a second crowd, a second disciple, eager to finish what she failed to start. The panic wasn't theatrical. It was tactical. Phones rang nonstop. Informants were shaken awake. Motel clerks were questioned. Car rental records pulled in bulk. Surveillance teams formed like blood clots, flooding highways and airports. Every follower became a potential trigger, every letter a possible coded order. In holding, Fromme's calm only deepened the dread. She didn't rant like a mad woman. She spoke like a believer who expected the world to understand. That made her more dangerous. The Bureau issued rapid bulletins: search for accomplices, locate weapons caches, monitor communications tied to cult remnants. Old fears resurfaced. 1969 resurrected in a new decade, aimed now at the presidency itself. And as agents moved through the night with sirens muted and weapons loaded, one truth pressed hard against every mind. If the click had become a bang, the country would already be burning. The investigation turned surgical. Names were pulled from dusty files: old Spahn Ranch associates, prison visitors, fringe activists who still called Manson Charlie like a prayer. Within 24 hours, the FBI and Secret Service built a moving net across California. Wiretaps authorized its speed, motel phone lines monitored, mail rooms flagged for anything addressed in odd handwriting or red ink. Agents sat in unmarked cars outside cheap apartments, watching curtains twitch, counting who came and went, memorizing license plates. Every tale became a slow-burn duel. Two vehicles separated by fate and traffic lights, reflections slipping across rearview mirrors. A woman buying groceries could be an errand or a courier. A late-night call could be loneliness or a coded instruction. Analysts listened to recorded voices for patterns, for repeated phrases that sounded harmless, but carried cult logic underneath. Trees, air, judgment, the system. Surveillance teams rotated in shifts until exhaustion blurred faces, but no one dared blink. The fear wasn't just another attempt, it was contagion. Cults don't need armies, only believers. In back rooms, agents traced financial trails, pawn shops, gun stores, motel receipts, gasoline purchases along routes leading to prisons and government buildings. Undercover operatives slid into circles of drifters and radicals, offering cigarettes and sympathy, baiting conversations toward Fromme and the cause. Each day produced fragments: a rumor of weapons hidden in desert sheds, a letter promising another sign, a follower seen near a bus station with a suspicious bag. Most leads died in dead ends, but the work continued because the cost of being wrong was unthinkable. The click had been a warning. Now the Bureau hunted the echo. The worst fear wasn't Fromme. It was what she could inspire. In briefing rooms, the phrase "second trigger" became a code for nightmare. Another disciple, another crowd, another president within arm's reach. Investigators knew copycats didn't need leadership, only a story sharp enough to cut through broken lives. The attempt at Capitol Park had already become legend in the wrong circles. A woman in red, a pistol raised, a nation frozen for one click. And somewhere out there, someone might hear that click as an invitation. The Bureau scanned for tremors: sudden gun purchases, extremist letters, cult-adjacent chatter in bars and bus depots. Agents visited prisons where Manson's name still carried weight, listening for whispers passing cell to cell like smuggled fire. They monitored radicals who hated Ford for different reasons, because Fanaticism doesn't care what uniform it wears. In Los Angeles, a surveillance unit tailed a drifter who'd once lived at Spahn Ranch. In San Diego, an informant claimed a new family was forming around a younger prophet. Every rumor tightened nerves. Even mundane movement. Someone boarding a Greyhound, someone checking into a motel under a fake name, looked like a fuse. The Secret Service redrew protective details overnight, changing routes, hardening distances, turning public appearances into controlled corridors of steel. Yet nothing felt enough. Fromme had proven the impossible. A single believer could get close. That truth cracked the illusion of safety around the presidency. As investigators chased shadows through California heat, the case stopped being only about one woman and one gun. It became about the vulnerability of history itself, how easily a fragile mind could step forward, squeeze a trigger, and force the world to live in a different timeline. The interrogation room was built to drain people. White walls, metal table, one buzzing light that made every second feel longer than it was. Lynette Fromme sat in the chair as if it were a throne, wrists cuffed, red dress now dull with dirt. Two agents faced her, one Secret Service, one FBI, folders stacked like bricks, evidence photos clipped and ready. They expected shaking, regret, hysteria. She gave them stillness. Her eyes didn't dart. They held. When they asked why, she didn't plead innocence. She spoke softly, almost patiently, as if they were slow children. "You don't understand," she said, and the sentence carried contempt without raising volume. They pushed her on accomplices. Did anyone help? Who supplied the weapon? Who ordered the act? She smiled at that. Small, private, loyal. "No one ordered me," she replied, and the way she said it made clear she believed she'd been chosen by something higher than orders. They slid a photo across the table. Manson's face, wild-eyed, captured like an animal behind glass. Her expression warmed for the first time, the brief glow of devotion. "Charlie is truth," she murmured, not as a slogan, but as a reflex. When the agent leaned in and warned her of federal charges of life behind bars, she barely blinked. "Life," she repeated, tasting the word like it meant nothing. The room grew colder with every answer she refused to give. She wasn't protecting a network, she was protecting a faith. And that, the agents realized, was harder to break than any criminal alibi. They changed tactics when fear failed. A psychologist joined the room, not in a suit, but in quiet clothes meant to soften the air, carrying no badge, only questions shaped like kindness. He didn't argue politics or law. He spoke about Lynette as a person, her childhood, her need to belong, the loneliness that makes a stranger's attention feel like salvation. He offered her a way out. "You were used." The word landed like an insult. Her jaw tightened, eyes sharpening, as if he'd attacked her religion. The agents played good cop, then bad, then silence. Hours passed with nothing but the fluorescent hum and the scrape of chairs. They laid out timelines, security footage, witness statements. They described how close Ford had been, how one chambered round would have painted the grass with presidential blood. Lynette listened, without flinching, as if death was just another concept. They tried guilt. Families, children in the crowd, the chaos she'd caused. She tilted her head, almost amused, and asked, "Why do you cry for one man but not for the trees?" That was the battlefield. Her moral compass had been rewired until violence could feel virtuous. The psychologist pressed again, gently, naming Manson's manipulation patterns: love bombing, isolation, control. Lynette's smile returned, colder this time. "You're the ones in chains," she said. "You just don't see them." The room became a war of language, every question a blade trying to cut her free, every answer a wall built from belief. They weren't interviewing a suspect anymore. They were wrestling a doctrine that lived inside her like a second heartbeat, refusing to die. Then the case found its strangest detail, the detail that sounded like mercy but smelled like calculation. The Colt M1911 had been loaded, the magazine seated, 4 rounds ready, yet the chamber was empty. No round had been racked into place. In the lab, technicians measured fingerprints, checked feed marks, examined the slide like it might confess. In briefings, agents circled the fact in red ink. A weapon raised at a president with no immediate ability to fire. Some called it incompetence, a fanatic too ignorant to understand her own gun. Others saw something darker, an intentional gap, a theatrical click meant to echo louder than a bullet, to create a myth without crossing the final line. Lynette's answers only fed both theories. "It was supposed to happen," she insisted, voice calm, eyes clear. "The system stopped it." She didn't say she forgot. She didn't say she chose. She left the room to invent its own story. The hidden round became the ghost inside the case file, haunting everyone who handled it. Because if she truly intended to kill, then history survived by a mechanical accident and an agent's reflex. But if she didn't intend to kill, if she wanted only spectacle, then the assassination attempt was still a loaded weapon aimed at the country's psyche. Proof that faith could walk right up to power and pull the trigger without remorse. Either way, the conclusion was the same. The click had exposed how thin the walls were. A missing round didn't make the act less deadly. It only made it more chilling, because it suggested intention could wear many masks, and America might never fully know which one she chose. The courtroom felt refrigerated, not by air conditioning, but by attention. Every bench was packed, reporters, federal observers, ordinary citizens who needed to see the threat in human form. Lynette Fromme entered in plain clothes, yet the room still saw the red dress in their memory like a blood stain that wouldn't wash out. She didn't shuffle or lower her head. She walked with a composure that insulted everyone who believed guilt should look like shame. Her defense team tried to position her as unstable, misguided, a woman swallowed by a cult. Fromme refused the lifeline. She interrupted, corrected, stared at the judge with an expression that suggested the court was beneath her. When the prosecution laid out the evidence, Secret Service testimony, photographs of the Colt .45, the magazine with 4 rounds, witnesses describing the moment the gun rose, she didn't deny it. She watched like it was a documentary about someone else. The Secret Service agent who tackled her testified in clipped, controlled phrases. The words sounded like metal, proximity, threat, takedown, chamber, empty. The judge warned her repeatedly to remain quiet, but Fromme's faith had no off switch. She spoke of trees, of poisoning, of America asleep, of truth locked behind bars. The prosecutor leaned forward and said the word every citizen feared: assassination. Fromme's eyes didn't move. Her mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile, and for a second the room understood the real horror. Not the failed shot, but the cold certainty behind it. Justice was supposed to melt monsters into regret. She sat there like ice, daring the system to prove it could win. Security treated the trial like a battlefield disguised as law. Metal detectors doubled. Galleries searched twice. Plainclothes agents sprinkled among reporters with their eyes never leaving hands. The fear wasn't that Lynette Fromme would lash out. She was already caged. The fear was the echo of her faith, the possibility of another believer stepping forward to finish what the clique had started. Threat assessments ran every morning, anonymous letters, strange calls to the courthouse switchboard, sightings of suspicious vehicles parked too long with engines idling. Deputies checked beneath benches for taped packages, swept hallways with dogs, watched the ceiling vents like danger could drip from above. In the crowd, faces became puzzles, too calm, too intent, too familiar from old Colt files. An undercover agent sat 3 rows back, carrying a newspaper that hid his hands. Across the aisle, another wore a press badge that wasn't quite right. Outside, unmarked cars lined the street, antennas angled like insect legs, radios whispering constant updates. The tension infected everyone. Jurors avoided eye contact. Witnesses walked in escorted clusters. Even the judge's voice carried a sharper edge. During a recess, a sudden shout from the corridor snapped the room into panic. Chairs scraped, hands reached for weapons, bodies shifted to shield the bench. It turned out to be nothing. An argument, a door slammed too hard, but nothing wasn't comforting anymore. This case had taught them that catastrophe could be one step, one hand, 1 second. In that courthouse, justice wasn't just blind. It was armed, alert, and terrified of the invisible. The verdict landed without drama, like a door locking. Guilty. The word traveled through the courtroom in a low wave, relief, anger, disbelief, each emotion sharp but controlled. Lynette Fromme didn't react the way convicted people are supposed to. No tears, no collapse, no bargaining glance toward the jury. She sat perfectly upright, hands folded, as if she'd been waiting for confirmation of a prophecy. The prosecutor outlined the stakes one last time. A president within arm's length, a Colt. 45 raised, a trigger pulled, history spared by an empty chamber and an agent's tackle. The judge read the sentence with a voice that tried to sound routine, but the weight turned every syllable heavy. Life imprisonment. A life measured not in years, but in bars. Fromme's face remained smooth, almost serene, yet her eyes held a stubborn spark, faith refusing to die under fluorescent light. When the bailiffs moved to take her, she finally spoke, not to plead, but to declare, words cold as steel, "You can lock me up. You can't lock up what's true." Cameras snapped, capturing the moment the system won, and the fanatics still believed she hadn't lost. As she was led away, the courtroom exhaled, but the air stayed uneasy, because justice had punished the act, yet nothing in her expression looked punished. And that was the lasting chill, the knowledge that a single believer could face life in prison and still feel victorious. Prison swallowed her like a machine, steel doors clanging shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The first nights were a ritual of noise, chains shouting, metal trays striking bars, yet Lynette Fromme moved through it with eerie calm, as if confinement was merely a change of scenery. The uniform erased every color, but in her mind the red dress still burned like a flag. Guards expected the arrogance to fade, the cult devotion to crumble under fluorescent light and routine humiliation. Instead, she adapted. She learned the schedules, the blind spots, the language of survival, and wore discipline like armor. Other inmates watched her with distrust, sensing the difference. She wasn't a hustler, wasn't chasing protection, wasn't trying to win. She behaved like someone already convinced of her own righteousness. She wrote letters obsessively, pages filled with prophecy, rage, and devotion, addressing Manson as if he were still present, still commanding the universe. In her cell, the walls became chapel stone. She spoke of ATWA, of purity, of persecution, turning herself into a missionary in a place built to crush belief. Some women laughed at her, others listened, drawn by the dangerous comfort of certainty. Prison politics shifted around her, but she didn't dissolve into it. She bent it, using attention like a blade. Even isolation didn't break her. Solitary only made her devotion louder in her own skull, a private sermon that never ended. In a world of punishment, she treated suffering as proof, every locked door reinforcing the myth that she was a martyr, not a criminal. The system had captured her body, but her mind remained somewhere else, still standing in Capitol Park, still hearing the click like a holy sound that almost changed history. The escape didn't happen like a frantic break. It happened like a mission. One morning, while the prison ran on routine and complacency, Fromme moved with unnatural focus, slipping through a narrow seam of human error and institutional fatigue. A door opened where it shouldn't have. A corridor went unguarded for seconds too long. She used those seconds like currency. By the time the head count hit and a name didn't answer, the facility shifted from order to alarm. Sirens exploded. Radio screamed her description into the air. Gates slammed shut, and guards flooded the yards with batons and shotguns, eyes wide with the same fear the nation had felt in Capitol Park. This woman was not just an inmate. She was a symbol that refused to stay buried. Outside, search teams fanned out into surrounding fields and back roads, helicopters slicing the sky, dogs pulling handlers forward with violent urgency. Fromme ran not like someone fleeing punishment, but like someone chasing a calling, her lungs burning, her feet tearing against dirt and gravel, her mind locked onto one thought: Charlie. Every step was fueled by obsession, not survival. She hid in brush, crawled through mud, drank from puddles, staying quiet while engines passed nearby. For a brief stretch, she became a ghost, and that terrified the system more than any riot. Then the net tightened. A dog barked sharp. A flashlight beam cut through the dark and found her face. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. When hands grabbed her, she went rigid, eyes cold, as if recapture was merely another chapter. Shackled again, dragged back beneath the same steel doors, she carried one message in her silence: belief can outrun prison until the world catches up. After the escape failed, something inside her began to rot quietly. Not remorse, never that. It was the slow decay of illusion, the kind that doesn't shatter in one moment, but crumbles day by day under the weight of time. Years passed in the same fluorescent light, the same locked routines, the same voices cycling in and out as inmates transferred or died. Manson's letters came less often. His influence, once felt like gravity, started to feel like distance. News reached her in scraps. The family was fading, followers aging into ordinary losers, the world moving on without the prophecy she'd sacrificed everything for. The myth she'd lived inside began to thin, In the mirror of prison glass, she saw her own face hardening into something older, sharper, less certain. She still talked about trees, still spoke of purity, but the words sounded more like habit than revelation. The new inmates didn't fear her the way the nation once had. To them she was history, a name from an old file. Even the guards grew bored, no longer angry, just indifferent, which was the one punishment her ego couldn't transform into martyrdom. Indifference meant she didn't matter. Nights became longer, silence became heavier, and sometimes, in the brief, unguarded seconds between sleep and waking, doubt slipped in like a thief. What if Charlie was just a man? What if the clique was not destiny, but failure? She would crush the thought instantly, bury it under doctrine, but the fact remained. She had to fight her own mind now. The illusion didn't collapse with fire and headlines. It collapsed in slow motion, behind steel, where no camera could capture it, and where the only witness was the woman who had once believed one bullet could rewrite the world. The cult didn't die with a siren or a verdict. It died the way fog dies, quietly, without witnesses, thinning until no one could swear it had ever been real. Outside the prison walls, the Manson family scattered into decades, becoming footnotes and punchlines, their faces aging into ordinary ruin. Some followers overdosed. Some disappeared into trailer parks and cheap marriages. Some found religion that demanded no blood, no prophecy. The myth that once held them together, Spahn Ranch fires, coded sermons, the promise of apocalypse, couldn't survive rent bills, sickness, and time. America changed channels. New scandals arrived, new wars, new monsters. Even Manson himself became less a prophet than a museum exhibit for a nation addicted to horror. In newspapers, his name shrank from front-page panic to late-night trivia, a symbol sold and resold until it lost its bite. And that was the real assassination of the family, the world's boredom. Inside, Lynette felt it like a slow suffocation. Visits grew rare. Letters stopped carrying urgency. The few remaining loyalists sounded tired, their devotion leaking away in misspellings and long gaps between lines. The movement she once imagined as eternal had become scattered dust. No army waited for her, no sacred war, no forest revolution, just silence. The vanishing cult left her stranded in the most brutal truth of all. She hadn't sacrificed herself for an unstoppable force. She had sacrificed herself for something fragile, something mortal, something that could fade like smoke when the world stopped looking. Parole hearings arrived like ghosts, periodic, unavoidable reminders that even life sentences have paperwork. When her case resurfaced, it triggered a familiar American reflex. Outrage first, questions later. In offices far from the prison, officials read old reports and saw the same image again. Ford's bodyguard surging, the Colt 45 lifted, the clique that almost became a national funeral. Could someone like that ever be safe outside? The law required procedure, not forgiveness. Psych evaluations were ordered, behavior logs reviewed, letters scanned for phonetic code. Fromme entered hearing rooms older now, her posture still rigid, her eyes still carrying that stubborn certainty, as if decades were irrelevant. Board members asked the same things in different words. Do you feel remorse? Do you understand the danger? Would you do it again? She answered like a believer cornered by unbelievers, careful but unsoftened. She spoke of causes, of persecution, of truth, never of guilt. The public didn't want nuance. Politicians feared headlines. Victims' advocates demanded permanence. Even some prison staff argued she remained a risk, not because she was violent in daily life, but because the ideology inside her had never truly surrendered. The debate became bigger than one woman. It became a national argument about justice and time. Does punishment expire when a body ages or when a mind changes? And if the mind never changes, if the eyes still shine with the same cold devotion, what exactly would release mean? She never gave them the ending they wanted. No trembling confession, no broken voice admitting she'd been wrong. Lynette Fromme aged, but apology never entered her vocabulary. In interviews and hearings, she treated remorse like surrender and surrender like betrayal. Even when her hair grayed and her body thinned under decades of concrete routine, the core posture remained unchanged. Spine straight, chin lifted, eyes fixed forward as if she were still facing the crowd at Capitol Park. People searched her face for cracks, some sign that time had healed whatever Colt poison had rewritten her brain. Instead, they found a woman who had built her identity on the refusal to admit failure. To apologize would mean admitting the clique was not destiny, that Charlie was not truth, that she had almost murdered history for a myth. That level of collapse would destroy her more completely than any prison could. So she clung to belief like a life raft, even as the cult itself vanished into dust. When asked about Ford, she didn't speak of the man. She spoke of symbols, systems, forests, corruption, always abstract, always safer than human guilt. The public called her cold. Some called her insane. But the truth was simpler and darker. She had chosen a story long ago, and survival meant never changing the script. In that way, she became her own prison, locked not by steel, but by pride and devotion fused together. The world moved on, forgave others, forgot most. But she remained frozen in that single second at 10:04 a.m., living forever inside a metallic click, still insisting it meant something holy, still refusing to admit it was only a failure that spared a life. Years later, the case returned like an old scar touched by accident. Documentarians rewound the footage frame by frame, historians dissected the moment with surgical calm, and America stared again at the thin line between routine politics and national catastrophe. Capitol Park looked harmless on screen, sunlight, families, a president smiling, but the audio carried the truth. The click, the scream, the sudden eruption of bodies moving to protect history. Analysts described the mechanics with brutal clarity. A Colt M 1911.45, magazine loaded, chamber empty. One missing round, one fraction of a second. Some called it luck. Others called it divine intervention. Security experts called it a vulnerability that should never have existed. The Secret Service agent's tackle became legend, praised as reflex, training, courage. Ford's calm afterward was cited as leadership under fire. Yet beneath the hero narratives, the real reckoning was darker. The assassination attempt wasn't sophisticated. It was intimate. It proved that power could be reached by a single believer in a crowd, someone with no army, no escape plan, only conviction. The clique haunted policymakers for decades, reshaping protective details, rewriting how presidents were allowed to touch the public. In classrooms and news segments, the case became a warning about cults and obsession, how ideology can hijack loneliness and turn it into a weapon aimed at the highest office. The nation didn't just remember the attempt, it measured itself against the timeline that almost happened, the alternate America where that click became a bang, and history took a different road soaked in blood. Society became its own courtroom long after the legal one closed. People argued not just about guilt, but about meaning, how a young woman could be transformed into a near assassin by nothing more than belonging. Cult experts testified in documentaries like Forensic Pathologists, explaining how love can be used as a leash, how isolation rewires the brain, how a leader becomes a substitute for self. The Fromme case was held up as proof that fanaticism doesn't need intelligence. It needs hunger. Critics called her evil. Others called her a victim. But the public couldn't fully settle on either verdict because her story exposed an uncomfortable truth. Many people are one crisis away from surrendering their identity to someone who promises certainty. The Manson family had used chaos like a drug, offering lost kids a myth where they mattered, where violence felt like purpose. That was the real weapon, meaning, in that light, the assassination attempt looked less like politics and more like psychology. A damaged soul aiming at history to prove her faith was real. Society judged the institutions too. Why were such cults allowed to grow unchecked? Why did loneliness become fertile ground for profits? The clique at Capitol Park became a symbol of how fragile democracy is, not just to guns, but to manipulation, charisma, and the human need to belong. The court of society didn't issue a sentence, it issued a mirror. And the reflection was unsettling. Because the case wasn't only about one woman in red. It was about how easily any nation can be threatened by invisible wars inside the mind. In the end, there was no cinematic closure, only quiet outcomes, the kind history prefers when it doesn't want to look too closely. Gerald Ford lived, finished his walk, carried the presidency through a fragile era, and the nation moved forward as if the clique were only a nightmare it woke from in time. Lynette Fromme returned to her cell, to steel doors and fluorescent days, where time did what punishment could not. It thinned everything. The cult vanished. The headlines faded. Even hatred cooled into distance, yet the moral remained sharp. The law had won, not with revenge, but with restraint. Arrest, trial, sentence, procedure, no chaos, no vigilante justice, no mythic bloodshed to feed the fanatic narrative. That was the system's victory, refusing to become what it fought. And still, something lingered like a question that wouldn't die. If the chamber had been loaded, if Buendorf's reflex had been 1 second slower, if the crowd had surged differently, would America have fractured into panic and retaliation? Would she have become a martyr in someone else's story? The case ended where it began, with vulnerability. Not the vulnerability of one president, but of any society that believes it is safe from obsession. The final image isn't the tackle or the courtroom. It's the silence after the click, the breath the nation held without realizing it was holding. A reminder that history isn't always changed by loud explosions. Sometimes it is saved by a mechanical failure, a trained hand, and a moment of luck. And somewhere behind bars, a woman who never apologized aged into the shadows, leaving one haunting question behind. How many others are still out there, waiting for their own holy moment to pull a trigger.